Welcome to Kathy on the Couch, your podcast for everyday clinicians who sit with grief, trauma, and the hardest human experiences every day. You weren't meant to carry this alone, and this is a space for therapists who hold space for others and sometimes need a place to be held too. I am Kathy, and I am your EMDR consultant trainer and thanatologist, specializing in methods of death, dying, and bereavement. I created this podcast to support those who do the deep work, especially trauma and grief therapists and EMDR clinicians needing a soft place to land, who want real conversations, meaningful support, and a community where the hard questions are finally welcome. We also are thrilled to share and announce our Kathy on the Couch membership community, which is your home for grief and trauma consultation, professional growth. It's by therapists, for therapists, where you find a monthly consultation group. You'll find a monthly NBCC CE training. You'll get access to a course module and resource kits. We're so happy to have you in one place, and you don't have to go looking for all those items in all the places. You can just come here. So we hold space for those who hold it all. That's our mission, where we talk honestly about all clinical challenges in the business of being a healer through curriculum development and training and breaking the silence to lead and thrive in the field without losing ourselves in the process. So if you're looking to join for deeper connection, I invite you to join our membership community to help you learn and grow. Or if you're an EMDR therapist looking to be certified or a consultant, we have our program EMDR University. Remember to give us a 5-star rating wherever you get your podcast. Now let's get comfortable and let's head on over to the couch.
Vygotsky's concept of the zone of proximal development gave rise to an educational theorist came to call scaffolding, the practice of providing temporary calibrated support that enabled the learner to accomplish something at the edge of their current capacity with the explicit intention of gradually withdrawing that support as learners' independent capacity develops. I brought something in that was genuinely about safety and something that had been going on, and I observed something in my work with this client.
Thank you so much for joining
us
on another episode of Kathy
every
on the Couch,
code we
the
work
podcast for
would tell
everyday
you to bring
clinicians.
forward
We
and
hope
had been
today's conversation has
during it
inspired you
weeks
spark new
in regards
ideas,
to
and
the
offer
plan
you
and the
practical tools
concern.
you can bring into your own
And
practice, whether you're just
what
starting out in the
happened
mental health
was
field
that
or you are a seasoned clinician.
the client
We're
didn't
grateful to
respond
have you
very
as
well
part
and
of our growing
complained.
community, and
And
Rewired 360 is here
rather
to
than engage
companion
with the
you along
clinical
your
and
clinical
ethical
career
substance
path.
of what I was
From the moment you
describing in the
begin your
dilemma,
professional journey, we offer
the
comprehensive
supervisor
support and
shared that
resources
they didn't
guide
know who
you
to
at
believe,
every
me or
stage.
the client. Who
So,
had, by
our
that
curriculum
point,
is
already
designed to
come
fill the gaps
to him
often found
with
in the
his own account
marketplace,
of things.
providing advanced training,
And
consultation, and mentorship as you
this was
progress
so
in your journey.
troubling.
Visit us
I
at
had
the
this
Kathy of the
felt
Couch
sense that something may
community, the
happen,
trauma
but I wasn't
community
sure.
for
Something happened in my
clinicians, or
body
the
in that
EMDR
moment. I can still
University
locate it. It was a
community
kind of
for
collapse,
EMDR
but it wasn't
clinicians.
dramatic
Be
or
sure to check
tearful. It
out
was
our
just
show
a
notes
quiet
for a full
cellular
list of
contraction.
resources. And
The
don't
thing
forget
that
to visit
before
our
became
swag
something I
store
needed
at
to protect myself from. I couldn't
rewired360.shop.
quite put my finger on
And
it.
this
But the
information
learning in
shared
their
on this
relational
podcast reflects
shift
perspectives and
stopped.
experiences of our
Not
guest
because I
hosts.
became
It's not
less
intended
capable,
to
because the
substitute
relational
for
conditions
professional
that made
consultation,
my
supervision,
learning
or
and
individual
comfort
guidance. If you have questions
neurobiologically possible
about how
had
to
just
apply
been
any of the
eliminated,
concepts, we encourage you to
squashed.
consult with your clinical
So,
supervisor, consultant, or licensing
When I
board.
brought what happened
As always,
to
follow those
others,
research-based
factually,
protocols
I
and
was
best
told I was
practices over work.
overreacting.
We're here to walk alongside
And
you as you deepen your clinical
Now
understanding.
there were two of them,
And
two people in
until
positions
next
of
time, keep
authority
connecting,
whose job
keep
it
learning,
was
and keep
to
rewiring
scaffold my
for
development.
success.
They confirmed that the frontier was not safe to stand at, that bringing uncertainty forward was a liability, and that the appropriate response to my clinical instincts was not curious engagement. It was skepticism, it was institutional hidden agendas, and I didn't stop growing as a clinician, but I stopped growing there. And I want to name that distinction carefully because I think it matters for everyone in the room who teaches, supervises, or consults, that the learner almost always finds another way forward. They go elsewhere, they find a peer, a book, another supervisor, a consultation group, where someone stays regulated when they bring the hard thing. What they lose is a developmental potential that was specific to that relationship, the growth that could have happened inside a scaffolded space that instead became the space where we had to survive. And that was my zone of proximal development collapsing in real time. It's what it felt like in my body when the regulated other became a source of threat rather than support. And that's why I say with full conviction and not as theory that the co-regulatory climate of a training or supervisory relationship is not a soft concern. It's the clinical and ethical infrastructure of our whole enterprise. Without it, we don't have a zone of proximal development. We don't have a zone of self-protection. We can't neurocept. And those aren't the same place. Different supervisor, different moment. I brought something to clinical attention that genuinely troubled me, and something I noticed in the room with a client in regards to manipulation. And I was trying to manage a lot of very difficult cases. I had several child deaths, lots of really hard things had happened, and my supervisor, I asked him a question. He just sat there and thought about what I was saying so critically and with such honor that it was just regulating. And what changed when his nervous system met mine? I didn't have language for it then. I didn't know what to call it, but it was co-regulation. I didn't know about polyvagal theory or the social engagement system yet, or the way the nervous system can literally lend itself to each other. But I just knew in my bones that something was being shifted, and that material I had been bracing against became not easy, but it was navigated. It was easily navigated, and the room felt different because of who was in it with me along on the journey in a shared experience. He wasn't above me, below me. He was right there with me. And not just that case, but so many cases. And that's what Vygotsky was describing, and that's what neuroscience has since confirmed. His doctoral dissertation was an analysis of Shakespeare's Hamlet, a careful study of how meaning was constructed through the tension between what a character says and what the text withholds. Isn't that interesting? Before he turned his attention to the developmental psychology, he was deeply formed by questions of narrative interpretation and the way language both reveals and conceals inner experience. That literary sensibility never left his psychological writing. It is part of why his work really reads differently from most academic theory of his era, And also, there is an attentiveness to complexity and ambiguity in Vygotsky that most of his counterparts lacked. Also, his work was suppressed by Stalinist authorities shortly after his death. The Soviet regime found his emphasis on social construction of mind ideologically convenient, and it foregrounded individual development within relationship in ways that didn't map neatly onto collectivist doctrine. It means his writings were banned for 2 decades, and by the time translations began reaching Western researchers in the 1960s and 1970s, he'd already been dead for 40 years. So I want to sit with that for a moment. The developmental psychologist whose ideas would eventually reshape educational theory, clinical supervision, and relational neuroscience spent most of the intervening period in obscurity, erased by a regime that found the idea of the individual developing within relationship too threatening to permit. Now, there's something darkly fitting about that, given that his central insight was about how power and relationship shape what becomes possible for a developing mind. If you've been following my work on Paulo Freire, that's exactly what he did. And Vygotsky understood decades before the neuroscience existed to prove it that learning is a relational process and that we can become shaped by who accompanies us. And that's what we're putting together in this developmental consultation framework. So what is the zone of proximal development? Vygotsky defined it as the distance between the actual developmental level as determined by independent problem solving at the level of potential development as determined through problem solving with adult guidance or in collaboration with more capable peers. So in plainer language, it's the gap between what a learner can do alone and what becomes possible when they're supported by a more skilled or experienced other. Supported. Not overseen, not powered over, co-regulated, co-experiencing. It's a relational space which growth happens, and it's not the place where the learner already is. So they're just up the head of the road a little bit. It's not a place so far beyond them that they can't see what's ahead and that they're arrivals. It's also the development of frontier that becomes accessible in this supported relationship. So I want you to hear how radical that formulation is. Vygotsky is not describing a fixed capacity that a learner possesses and that a good teacher helps him discover. He's describing a capacity that doesn't exist in isolation, that only comes into being in relationship. So that's the learner's potential development is not a static quantity waiting to be measured. It's a dynamic, a relational force, a relational potential, a didactic space that expands or contracts depending on the quality of the scaffolding and structure around it. Now, he arrived at this insight without the polyvagal theory, without relational neuroscience, without any of the biological frameworks that would later confirm what he's describing. He got there through observation, clinical attention, theoretical reasoning under political conditions that would eventually try to erase him, and that the neuroscience has since caught up with him is a testament to the precision of his thinking. So here's where it becomes especially interesting for those of us trained in trauma and nervous system work, because when I read Vygotsky through a polyvagal lens, what I hear is precise description of co-regulation and the neurobiological conditions under which learning becomes possible. And I reflected on that within my own life, and I resonated with a few experiences where I learned because of the person and the relationship I had in front of me. And that neuroscience of co-regulation begins with a deceptively simple observation. The human nervous system doesn't regulate in isolation. That's from Porges' work. And from the earliest months of life, our regulatory state of ourselves as infants is organized through the proximity and attunement with our caregivers, with their nervous system. And they don't merely comfort their infant. We literally lend our own regulated nervous system to the infant's dysregulated one, creating the external scaffolding. Their regulatory capacity gradually develops and can regulate. So it's not a feature of infancy that disappears in adulthood. It's a feature of human neurobiology that persists across the lifespan. So adults in states of stress, novelty, or challenge continue to regulate more effectively in the presence of attuned, regulated others. And you already know this from clinical work, that the therapeutic relationship is not the container where healing occurs. It's a neurobiologically significant mechanism to the healing itself. There's something I want you to think about before we get into today's content. Think about a moment in your clinical training or your personal life, for that matter, when you were trying to learn something genuinely difficult, something at the edge of your current capacity. Not review, not consolidation, something new, a new concept. Now think about who was with you in that moment, not just whether there was someone there, but whether that someone was regulated, whether they were calm in the face of your uncertainty, whether their presence made the difficulty feel navigated rather than overwhelming. If you've had that experience, a supervisor who stayed steady while you fumbled through a hard case, a consultant who held space without filling it with their own expertise, a peer who sat beside you and then not knowing without rushing you towards resolution, then you already understand in your body. That's what today's episode is about. You already know what Lev Vygotsky was describing when he formulated one of the most enduring concepts in developmental psychology, the Zone of Proximal Development. The Rewired 360 podcast, I'm Kathy Couch, LCSW, fellow in thanatology, your EMDR consultant, and the founder of Rewired 360 and Willow Creek Counseling. This episode is 3 of our 6-part series, Roots of the Revolution, why pedagogical theory belongs in clinical training spaces. In episodes 1 and 2, we looked at Paulo Freire's banking model of education and John Dewey's framework of experiential learning. Today we go deeper in the relational architecture of learning itself through the sense of a Soviet psychologist who died at 37, whose work was suppressed for 2 decades, who nevertheless produced a concept that the relational neuroscience of the 21st century is still catching up to. If you're coming to this episode fresh, here's the orienting premise of the whole series. The way we teach is inseparable from what we teach. Process is content, and if you are a trauma-informed clinician who also trains, supervises, teaches, or consults in any capacity, then the design of your educational and consultative spaces is a clinical and ethical question, not just a logistical one. Each episode in this series focuses on a foundational pedagogical thinker whose central insight has been confirmed by neuroscience, trauma research, or both. Today's thinker identified the relational conditions under which development becomes possible. He gave us a framework for understanding not just what people learn, but how the presence of a regulated, attuned other makes learning neurobiologically available in the first place. That framework has profound implications for training design, clinical supervision, and consultation practice, and that's what we're unpacking today. So Lev Vygotsky was born in Russia in 1896, and he died of tuberculosis in 1934. He was only 37 years old. He'd been actively publishing for less than a decade, and in that compressed window, he produced more than 180 works, books, articles, lectures, manuscripts, many of them compiled from his notes and never intended in the form in which we now read them. What is less commonly known is that Vygotsky did not begin as a psychologist. He began as a literary critic. Vygotsky's concept of the zone of proximal development gave rise to what educational theorists came to call scaffolding. And what it is, we just need to provide calibrated support that enables them to be present. So here's something I want to name because I find it both fascinating and also a little maddening that I've reviewed a lot of curriculum, and I've been brought into a consultation on course design for training programs, continuing education platforms, graduate level clinical curriculum, and I can't tell you how many times I've opened a curriculum framework from a university, a professional association, a training institute, and seen the word scaffolding sitting right there in the learning design standards. Include scaffolding. Ensure content is scaffolded. Scaffolding should be evident throughout. There's no mention of zone of proximal development or this dynamic. And this is the part that still sits with me. The person reviewing your curriculum for compliance with standard is not a clinician. They're a gatekeeper. They don't have clinical training. They've never sat with a grieving client or held the edge of trauma disclosure, never navigated the developmental complexity of a supervisory or consultee relationship. But they hold the institutional power. They endorse curricula. They determine what gets through, what gets sent back, and they're looking not for the clinical sophistication, not for the developmental precision or for the evidence that you've actually located that learner's zone. They're looking for the gaps, reasons to reject, language that doesn't match the template, a box that wasn't checked in the way the institution expected it to be checked, the video that wasn't recorded with the exact script that they asked for, while also asking you to be original. I've been in that process. I've had curriculum I built from genuine clinical knowledge and pedagogical care reviewed by someone whose expertise was institutional compliance and been told it was insufficient, not because clinical reasoning was wrong, because it didn't conform to some sort of structural expectation that had been written by people equally distant from the clinical room. And I've watched that same process wave through curricula that were clinically hollow but administratively tidy. Boring. That's not a quality assurance system, that's a power structure wearing the language of standards. So what Paulo Freire called that was a hidden curriculum. The unspoken lessons that institutional structures teach about who holds authority, whose knowledge counts, and what the real actual rules of the game are. The nod, the wink, and really the hidden curriculum says make it legible to the people who control access, regardless of whether those people have any basis for evaluating what you built. The hidden curriculum of institutional gatekeeping doesn't just filter content, it quietly determines who gets endorsed and who's kept out. So not on the basis of clinical competence or pedagogical integrity, but on the basis of proximity to that institutional power. Do they know you? And fluency in institutional language. Some people move through those gates effortlessly. Others find the gate perpetually slightly closed. And with someone on the other side scanning the document for the gap that justifies not opening it. And I think about what Vygotsky would make of that, a concept he developed through careful observation of how development actually happens in relationship. It's all reduced to a checklist item administered by someone with no framework for evaluating whether the development is actually occurring. Scaffolding is a decoration. Scaffolding is compliant language. Scaffolding with no zone inside it. And the irony is that the assessment process itself acts exactly what it fails to require of others. It offers no scaffolding to the curriculum developer. It locates no developmental frontier. It provides no calibrated support. It's just judging from a position of institutional authority whether the document in front of it contains the right words in the right places. And because scaffolding is not a feature you add to a course after you've designed it, it's a calibration problem that has to be solved before you design anything. Too far below the learner's developmental frontier, and the support is unnecessary and potentially patronizing, but too far above, the gap can't be bridged and the learner is left with a sense of failure rather than growth. So the scaffold has to find the zone, the place where you challenge and support, and they're in productive tension. And you can't find that zone if you've never asked where the learner actually is. You can't evaluate whether someone else found it if you've never been in that clinical room yourself. And I remember sitting with a curriculum review, a continuing education program for licensed clinicians where every module had been designed around what the content expert knew and wanted to teach. It was really impressive material, really sophisticated, and it had been built with no information whatsoever about who the participants were, what they were really carrying into the room, what their actual developmental edges were. Also, when I raised this response, all I got was, well, we said it was an intermediate level training, as if a label on the tin was the same understanding as what's inside the people sitting in front of you. That's not scaffolding, that's content delivery with the word scaffolding written in. So for professional clinical training, one-size-fits-all content delivery isn't merely insufficient. The pedagogical failure of calibration, an early career clinician working at the edge of basic clinical competence, isn't the same as an experienced, seasoned private practice therapist in the same zone. So the training that assumes otherwise isn't scaffolding anyone. It's presenting relational void. And so that's why pre-training assessment matters. Not as a bureaucratic formality, but who are we going to be teaching? What is their level? Not as another box to satisfy a reviewer who'll never meet the participants, but as a genuine attempt to locate their actual frontiers. And that's a recommendation here. The most effective continuing education isn't designed around this feature of Vygotsky's original formulation that gets underemphasized in most educational applications. When he described the zone of proximal development, he named two sources of scaffolding: adult guidance and more capable peers. This is not a minor detail. It's an argument for the pedagogical power of peer learning. They do that in China, where they have peers in the classroom, and the peers actually work with other students to get them up to grade level. They did this in the Harkness model at Dartmouth, where the peers sit around a table and they're able to have discussion and peer-led learning. And it points towards something contemporary learning sciences confirm: peer learning, when well structured, is among the most powerful drivers of professional development. So think about what this means in a room full of experienced clinicians, a group of practitioners at various levels of specialization. Experience represents an enormous different variety of zones, each of which can serve scaffolding for the others. So the early career clinicians questioned surface assumptions, and the experienced practitioners stopped examining those because they've applied them. And so the zone of proximal development flows in multiple directions. And that's where the didactic learning process needs to be, that we're both peers. When someone in EMDR certification becomes a consultant, they move to a peer design. I've had dynamics in consultation where the consultant was the expert and I was the, as Freire says, the banking model that in the deposit. And the training designs that build structured peer consultation, group, case-based learning, we're not supplementing the real learning that happens in the didactic presentation. We're activating that relational scaffolding, without which deep learning is neurobiologically improbable. So the most sophisticated resource in clinical training rooms isn't the presenter, it's the accumulated wisdom of the participants. And designs that ignore that are leaving the most powerful scaffold unused. So it's not a minor detail, and I want to sit with it and frame it for a moment, because I think we underestimate it in clinical training design constantly, and if I'm honest, in ways I've underestimated it myself. But I run consultation groups. I've run them for years. Early on, I think I carried an unexamined assumption that my job was to be the most useful person in the room, and that the value participants were taking home was primarily moving through me, my clinical reasoning framework, my read on cases. Not always, but I think that I felt that pressure. And there were moments where that was true, but there were also these other moments where I eventually learned to recognize and then protect where the most important thing happens in the room had nothing to do with me. I'd also been in those rooms where people presented that to me as well. And it was always in awe. And a neuroclinician would ask a question, not as particularly sophisticated one by conventional measures, sometimes almost a basic one, the kind that more experienced practitioners had long since stopped asking out loud, and something would shift. An experienced clinician across the room would go quiet because the question had surfaced an assumption they'd stopped examining, something they had automated so thoroughly they'd forgotten it was a choice. The neuroclinician, not yet knowing something that my expertise cannot, it cracked open a space that fluency sealed shut. So that's a zone moving in multiple directions simultaneously, and it only happens if the design makes it possible. So the group of practitioners at various levels and expertise represents this enormous pool. Clinical training rooms isn't the presenter, it's the accumulated clinical wisdom of the participants. And Vygotsky's framework has particular resonance for two contexts that sit at the heart of how clinical competence actually develops over time: supervision and consultation, which we've all been a part of. And I want to be personal here because I think the theory only lands when it has a body attached to it. So clinical supervision is, in Vygotskian terms, the prototypical zone of proximal development relationship, a more experienced other providing calibrated responsive scaffolding within which the supervisee's clinical frontier expands. The parallel to the therapeutic relationship isn't coincidental, and both relationships involve an attuned, regulated other lending their nervous system and competence to support the development of someone at the edge of their capacity. Both require attunement to the learner's level, and understanding this through the zone of co-regulation invites supervisors to ask, am I scaffolding the supervisee's actual developmental frontier? Am I providing support calibrated to my own anxiety about their performance or to their developmental need? They're not the same thing, but the difference matters, and I've been on both sides of that dynamic. I know what it feels like when a supervisory relationship is doing a thing it's supposed to do, when someone's tracking my actual developmental frontier, calibrating their support where I am rather than they wish I were. And I know from the story I told earlier what it feels like when that relationship becomes something you have to survive rather than you can grow inside of. And those are abstract distinctions. They live in the body and they shape what becomes possible for the clinician long after supervision ended. So that's where the Vygotskian consultant begins creating conditions for the consultee to lead, articulate the problem in their own terms, to surface what they already know, where they feel uncertain. It's that you've taught them how to assess themselves so they know the question to bring and to demonstrate their current level of competence. So the consultant listens for content, developmental information. What do they need next? Not what the consultant would need or a more advanced practitioner, but what that person needs. So in my own consultation practice, it's meant letting the consultees lead the presentation of their material, listen, don't interrupt, don't just come to me with a case form and say, here it is, resisting the pull to redirect or reframe or fill the silence with expertise, this attention, using an uninterrupted account as a primary data source for this developmental assessment. And where does their reasoning show fluency? Where does it hesitate? What questions do they ask? What questions do they not ask? The consultee knows where they are and what they're working towards, and the consultation becomes a transfer and co-constructed map of their own developmental terrain, and the map belongs to them when we're done. This approach honors what Vygotsky understood about the social construct of competence, that the consultee's capacity is not fixed quantity to be measured and reported back, but a dynamic. The consultant's first job is not to answer, so locate the frontier. You can't scaffold what you haven't found if you're filling the room with your own expertise before the person in front of you's had a chance to show you where they actually are. So I want to close with what I always close with in this series, a set of design questions, because the Vygotskian framework, like Frere and Dewey's, is ultimately diagnostic. The value isn't just knowing our theories, it's what the theory reveals about our current practice and what makes it possible. 5 questions I'd invite you to sit with and answer them quickly. How do you assess participants' development before designing what comes next? Are you calibrating your scaffolding? Are you deciding where they actually are or where you assume they are? If you're honest, where is the institutional compliance template? Where does that require you to say they are? How does your own training design activate peer scaffolding, where participants with different levels brought into a structured relationship, not just in the seated room, but can also have interaction, developmental contact? That's what I do in my EMDR consultation program, EMDR University. What's the co-regulatory climate of the room? Is it our own regulated presence? Are we presenting from a state that contracts with neurobiology, safety? And the question I return to most often before I record or teach for opening a group is, what am I bringing to the room? So I'd invite you to think about, what is your consultation practice? Do you begin your own assessment of their developmental frontier before offering expertise? Lead with answers before the question's been fully formed. If you lead with answers, who's that serving? Where in their training or supervision is scaffolding or the next step? Graduated challenge, transparent intention designed to be removed as independent capacity grows. Notice a word, curriculum, document, a case presentation form, a design decision with reasoning. So I know these aren't comfortable questions. I know because I return to them, I'm not always satisfied with my own answers. They require a particular kind of honesty about the gap between our intentions and designs, but they're questions that move practice forward, and they're worth returning to every time we step into a supervision or consultant role. So Lev Vygotsky was not writing clinical training or EMDR consultation or continuing education design. He wasn't writing about gatekeepers who hold institutional power without clinical knowledge, or supervisors who chose not to believe the person they're supposed to be developing, or curriculum reviewers scanning documents for gap that justifies rejection. He was a developmental psychologist in early Soviet Russia, working under political conditions that would eventually suppress everything he produced. He was trying to understand how children develop language and thought and problem solving. He kept arriving at the same answer, through relationship, through the presence of an attuned other, through the co-regulation scaffolding of a more experienced mind genuinely lending itself to a less experienced one. The relational neuroscience of the 21st century has confirmed what he described, and clinical training world is still in many ways designing as if it hasn't heard the news. Still using the word scaffolding without the zone, still placing non-clinicians as gatekeepers of clinical curriculum, still building supervision that structures that when pressure comes, asking the supervisee to carry the relational failure alone. I know what it cost me in specific moments of my training, my early career, my navigation of institutional systems, when the person who was supposed to scaffold my development chose to control instead, or skepticism instead, or compliance over clinical integrity. And I know what it gave me in other moments when someone stayed regulated in the face of my uncertainty and made the difficult thing navigable. Both of those experiences are in this episode. Both of them are in the way I design now. Vygotsky's invitation is to design for the zone, to locate the actual frontier, not the assumed one, not the institutionally convenient one, to calibrate the support where the learner is, to lend our regulated nervous system attuned attention, not because it's philosophically elegant, because it is how human beings grow. So coming up in episode 4, Maria Montessori and self-directed learning, what it means for a learning environment to be designed for the autonomic safety, and why that turns out to be a neurobiological question before it's a philosophical one. That's an episode I've been looking forward to for a long time. If today's episode was helpful and useful, share it with a supervisor, training director, colleague who runs consultation groups. The full written post with APA citations available at the Rooted Practice blog at rewired360.com. The link is in the show notes. I'm Kathy Couch. This is the Rewired 360 podcast. Thanks for being here, and we'll see you next time. Thank you so much for joining us on another episode of Kathy on the Couch, the podcast for everyday clinicians. We hope today's conversation has inspired you, sparked new ideas, and offered you practical tools you can bring into your own practice, whether you're just starting out in the mental health field or you are a seasoned clinician. We're grateful to have you as part of our growing community, and Rewired 360 is here to companion you along your clinical career path. From the moment you begin your professional journey, we offer comprehensive support and resources that guide you at every stage. So, our curriculum is designed to fill the gaps often found in the marketplace, providing advanced training, consultation, and mentorship as you progress in your journey. Visit us at the Kathy on the Couch community, the trauma community for clinicians, or the EMDR University community for EMDR clinicians. Be sure to check out our show notes for a full list of resources, and don't forget to visit our swag store at rewired360.shop. And this information shared on this podcast reflects perspectives and experiences of our guest hosts. It's not intended to substitute for professional consultation, supervision, or individual guidance. If you have questions about how to apply any of the concepts, we encourage you to consult with your clinical supervisor, consultant, or licensing board. As always, follow those research-based protocols and best practices in your work. We're here to walk alongside you as you deepen your clinical understanding. And until next time, keep connecting, keep learning, and keep rewiring for success. Take care.